You know, I've often wondered why it is that we suddenly get supposed skill shortages in particular areas, particular sectors. Why does this happen? It's a question I hope we'll deal with tonight. So let's put it this way. What are state and federal governments doing in terms of industry planning? Are they aware of where the skill shortages might be in future? And what are they doing about workers when they do come to Australia in terms of protecting their interests and looking after their skills and their training and ensuring that as vulnerable workers who are forced to leave a country, they're not being exploited by unscrupulous bosses? Let's find out.
I think that what's missing in Australia today is proper industry planning. Unless governments are actually involved in understanding where economic growth is going to be in the country and planning for it in the long term, they won't put in place and can't put in place the programs that are needed today to address the longer term needs. You can't expect to train people or retrain people or change the direction of training and skills in the country on a very short-term basis. You need to be training today for the skills that you need in 5 to 10 years' time. You can't start training today for the skills you need next week. The reason we have such a high growth in 457 visas in Australia is the lack of planning that's gone into our industries and the lack of labour market planning that's gone on, and governments are responsible for those things.
What's involved in planning? What's involved in taking an assessment of what's going to happen in the future and in actual planning for industry, do you believe?
I think the governments have to sit down with the people who are engaged in industry. So they need to sit down with major employers, major employer groups who have a finger on the pulse of what their industries are doing, and they need to sit down with unions. The trade union movement, the union leaders, union delegates know what's happening in their companies. They know what the competition is. They have a feel, they have a sense, they have industry intelligence, if you want to call it that, that can feed into ideas about the future. The other thing that governments can do in terms of industry planning is to make firm decisions about the sorts of industries they want to encourage and develop in the country. Okay. Victoria, for example, made a decision some time ago that it wanted to become a biotechnology centre in Australia, and it has invested in biotechnology industries. It's invested in medical research. It's invested in things like the synchrotron. The Victorian government, having made quite firm decisions about some of the industries they wanted to attract to the state, then put in place appropriate programs to make sure that the training is being delivered to workers so that we've got the workforce. It's pointless trying to attract industry if you're not then going to have the workforce that can operate the industry. It then just becomes a wasted exercise. What we've had over the last 10 years is just a lack of attention to longer-term industry planning at the national level.
Why has the federal government dropped this ball?
Oh, look, I think that the federal government's approach to industry planning is a bit like its approach to many other things. Employers know best. So they've left it to the market, not understanding that governments have a pretty fundamental role to play in the marketplace that is the Australian economy. I think we're talking about a very unintelligent approach to industry planning that's going to have consequences for Australia and for Australian workers. But that approach to the lack of approach to industry planning manifests itself in what we see today, which is a knee-jerk reaction to skill shortages, a lack of understanding that those shortages are going to arise sometime in the future, and the government's solution is to use temporary overseas workers to fill the jobs because they haven't done what they need to do.
And it's a lack of addressing a number of areas. Michelle mentions industry policy development, but it's not making investment, either the thinking investment or the funding investment in research and technology, in the fundamentals of infrastructure, both social infrastructure and educational infrastructure. So the TAFE system has been underfunded, undercut really for a long time. The tertiary education sector, in all the areas where we see the growth economy, we're relying on bringing in short-term skills from overseas to quickly fill gaps, not looking at indeed next year or 5 years or 10 years down the track.
And also we're not looking at long-term migration to this country?
So we're not looking at either the migration regime overall or indeed linking migration with employment. That interconnection is essential. And so, as Michelle points out, the labour market needs analysis hasn't been done. But likewise, that's a much bigger picture. We're looking at a global labour market now. Not only are Australian workers seeking work overseas in specific industries, but Australia is now known as a market in particular industries. So in engineering, for example, and in mining and the whole resources economy, then Australia is a growth economy. Workers around the world know that. Workers exchange information, trade unions exchange information, and governments do too. But we're not being very clever at a national level in Australia of promoting what we need a number of years down the track. And indeed, if you look at it at a global level, there are decisions that are made at a government level, but there are individual decisions too. When a worker chooses to migrate, it's not because they don't necessarily like where they're living now, but there is opportunities elsewhere that, in the case of a lot of unskilled migrant workers, then it is not possible to survive in those economies. Indeed, their families depend on the remittance payments that come back from overseas to actually support the very survival of those families. And whole economies depend on that. There are countries who are our near neighbours, Indonesia, the Philippines, Fiji, many of the Pacific Islands, who rely on the remittance payments from their family members based in Australia or New Zealand or elsewhere. And it's a part of those countries' policy, their public policy is actually about the export of labour, in fact. And they have whole government departments and ministries set up for the deployment, the recruitment and deployment of overseas contract workers. So the health industry, for example, from the Philippines, there are institutions in the Philippines that are training healthcare workers, not for the Filipino clinics and hospitals and health services, but for the American and Australian and New Zealand health services. Something like 70% of the gross domestic product of the Philippines is overseas workers' remittances. It's the biggest part of the economy.
So the governments in countries like the Philippines then come to absolutely rely on those remittances as a major contribution into the coffers of the country, effectively. Not through taxes, but by then the expenditure of family members in the home country.
Okay, the lack of monitoring of 457 visa holders, the lack of monitoring of their conditions, really, actually acknowledging that a lot of those people are living in very substandard conditions in Australia. Do you believe that that's tying into our government actually getting into those labour markets at the cheapest possible level? Like, are we just going, okay, yeah, we'll undercut you?
Well, that's a natural outcome. That's the impact of having a deregulated labour market. Without the legal mechanisms to enforce decent conditions, then you will see an undercutting of conditions and wages. And so the people on 457 visas are the most vulnerable because, let's face it, if their jobs are cut, they are deported from the country. So if their rights are absolutely open to abuse, more so than Australian workers. And it's both to do with their legal status, but it's also to do with their capacity to engage in the society and in the workplace more generally. If they're lacking language skills or knowledge of the country, lack of contacts within the community, all those protection mechanisms don't exist. 457 visa holders are the most open to exploitation. So where bad employers want to exploit workers, that's an easy avenue for them to do so, either within the legal system as it stands or indeed as a loophole underneath that. So the fact that this inquiry, parliamentary inquiry, didn't address the fundamental issues of workers' rights is a big missing. I think it's not only irresponsible in terms of not actually looking at the big picture, but it's not actually linking to the fundamental reasons why the exploitation occurs, nor looking at what the Australian government's responsibilities and the possibilities for action can be on a more global scale.